Hey, learning enthusiasts. Welcome to Professor Lisa's reading of On Learning from Failure, an essay from the book Habits of the Creative Mind, second edition, written by Richard E. Miller and Ann Jurecic. When we watch children building a sandcastle on a summer beach, we see creativity in action. The castle grows and becomes more elaborate as the children add moats, towers, turrets, and carefully laid rows of shells. The ongoing construction is always under threat of destruction from the rising tide, careless passers-by, impish older siblings, and frustrated members of the construction crew. But, unless disagreements and exhaustion take over, the castle builders convert whatever damage has been done into a temporary setback. They experiment to figure out how to build a better moat to stay the tide. A bucket brigade creates a pile of wetter sand. The construction project is moved up or down the beach to a better location. When children are building sandcastles, they're not afraid of failure because the stakes are low. The point is simply to have fun. However, once we become adults, we're likely to avoid situations where the prospect of failure is high. Whether at work or school, most of us fear tackling a complex problem in front of our peers because of the possible consequences of failing. Embarrassment, shame, a lower grade, a demotion. This fear of failure stifles creativity and innovation. Not all people respond to fear of failure in the same way, though. In fact, creative people tend to have an attitude toward failure that's more like the kids on the beach than like a typical adult trying to solve a problem at work or a student trying to figure out what the teacher wants him to say. In What the Best College Students Do, Ken Bain argues that what sets the best students apart from the rest is their willingness to acknowledge failures, to explore them, and to learn from them. Unlike less creative people, they don't deny their mistakes or get defensive about errors. Where does this ability to bounce back from failure come from? To answer this question, Bain points to a study that compared two groups of 10-year-olds who were each given a series of puzzles. The first 8 problems required the students to make real effort, but the challenges matched the students' age and education level. The next 4 problems were designed to be too hard for the students to solve. Over the first 8 problems, there were no differences in how the groups performed. Both groups talked about the problems as they worked through them, had fun, and came up with roughly the same number of correct solutions. On the second set of problems, however, the group's reactions differed greatly from each other. The first group got frustrated, complained, and tried to change the rules. They started to make surprisingly poor choices, shifted their focus away from the problems, and gave up. By contrast, the second group continued to encourage each other, tested different approaches, and seemed to thrive on the challenge, even though they couldn't solve the hard problems either. What caused the divergent responses? The students were grouped by researchers based on their attitudes toward intelligence. The first group had a fixed view of intelligence, and the second group believed, conversely, that with effort you could become smarter. As shorthand, we'll call members of the first group the knowers, and members of the second group the learners. When the knowers faced failure, they looked for an escape route. Because their failures called their intelligence into question, they went into mental tailspins, reverting to strategies that might be expected from preschoolers. The learners didn't take failure personally. Because they believed they could develop intelligence, working on the problems was its own reward. Even if they never found solutions, they valued learning things along the way. Obviously, We can't just snap our fingers and change ingrained beliefs and patterns of behavior. And we can't change the fact that in some situations, when the stakes are immediate and high, it's nearly impossible to sustain an impersonal attitude toward failure. We believe, however, that it is possible to cultivate more creative attitudes toward failure through practice. One of the most important locations for such practice is in school, working on assignments that allow time for experimentation and revision. That's why we provide practice sessions that invite you to engage with open questions that can't be answered simply with facts or by following a formula to a straightforward conclusion. We want you to use your writing to explore genuine knotty problems, ones that challenge you to think thoughts that are new to you. Under these circumstances, it is inevitable that your initial efforts will fall short of the mark. You can see that as a failure or as an opportunity to practice new ways of working on a problem. When we learn from failure, we discover that practice never ends. Richard likes to tell the story of what happened when he started revising his doctoral dissertation for publication. Having set the work aside for a couple of years while he was settling into his new job, he was able to return to it with fresh eyes. And after careful consideration and some additional research in the archive, he decided that there was really only one thing that needed to be changed about his dissertation, which he'd spent more than 2 years writing: the thesis. That's all. Only the frame of his argument. Only what he thought he'd understood about the problem. While this may sound like an unusual experience, it's actually both common and predictable. What we put down in paper isn't destiny. What we put down in writing isn't destiny. It's a snapshot of a mind at work on a problem. And if that mind keeps working on the problem, then a snapshot taken at a later time will, of necessity, look different. We have a name for that difference: learning. Practice Session 1, Part 1, A History of Failure. Habits: beginning, persisting, speculating. Activities: imagining, remembering, writing. As a thought experiment, look back at what kind of student you were in middle school and in high school. Then imagine what school would have been like for you if grades hadn't mattered to parents or college admissions committees. Would you have taken more risks as a writer and learner, or would you have just goofed around more? Set aside at least 45 minutes to reflect on the kind of school that could foster an environment in which students, including you, would be willing both to work hard and to fail big. Write a description of the key characteristics of your imagined school. Consider whether there are classes, teachers, or majors that you think foster the kind of environment you describe. Practice Session 1, Part 2. What education might entail. Habits: connecting, persisting, exploring. Activities: note-taking, reading, writing. The word failure appears one time in Danielle Allen's What is Education For?, which we've included in the reading section at the end of this book. We'd like you to read Allen's essay, marking those places where you feel she answers the question posed in the title of her essay. When you're finished, compare the passages you've marked with what you wrote in Part 1 of this practice session. Is Allen's sense of education's purpose in conversation with your own experiences in school? Does her vision align with the vision you articulated? To think these matters through, we'd like you to write an essay that considers Allen's use of failure, a word she holds off using until the final paragraph of her essay. What would you say Allen wants us to learn from this failure? Practice Session 2, Failing Better. Habits: connecting, persisting, speculating. Activities: reading, writing. In Fail Better, an essay about writing, Zadie Smith identifies the cliché as a small-scale example of literary failure. She asks, what is a cliché except language passed down by Das Man, the man, used and shop-soiled by so many before you, and in no way the correct jumble of language for the intimate part of your vision you meant to express. With a cliché, you have pandered to a shared understanding, you have taken a shortcut, you have represented what was pleasing and familiar rather than risked what was true and strange. Obviously, there are occasions when settling for the pleasing, familiar, and expected is the polite thing to do. For example, birthday cards, thank you notes, letters of condolence. But to write an essay in this way is to fail to rise to the challenge of the form. The essayist works against cliché, both at the micro level of the sentence and at the macro level of structuring the delivery of a piece's insight, seeking new thoughts that can then be shared with writing that is productively unsettling. We'd like you to choose one of the readings included at the end of this volume and identify passages where the writer does, or in the case of the Declaration of Independence, the writers do, something unexpected. We are accustomed to thinking of a failure to meet expectations as a shortcoming, but Smith invites us to rethink such moments as instances when the writer has successfully avoided using a cliché. Spend at least 40 minutes reflecting and writing about 3 passages you identified as instances in which the writer did something unexpected. What do these moments lead to? Is there a way to assess whether these decisions are successes or failures? Practice session 3 of failure to understand. Habits: paying attention, persisting, questioning. Activities: remembering, selecting, writing. A standard college application essay prompt asks students to write about a time when they learned from failure. Inevitably, this prompt generates essays that illustrate how the writer is a better person for having stumbled in one way or another. We want to avoid the mandatory moral message that such a prompt elicits. But we still want you to reflect on your own experience of failing to understand an important concept or idea. We want you to write, in other words, about your experience of failure in the realm of thought. What were the consequences of your failure? What did you do to try to overcome your failure to understand? What rewards, if any, followed from overcoming that failure? Write a reflective piece that captures a failure of thought and explores your response to that failure.